Hello, everybody. Welcome back to LettermenRow.com. I am Jeremy Birmingham. This is Talking Stuff, the Ohio State recruiting podcast brought to you by Buyers Automotive. If you're looking for an auto, go to buyersauto.com and find the greatest and widest selection of new and used vehicles anywhere in Central Ohio. If you're looking for Ohio State recruiting coverage and stuff of that nature, stay right here today. Myself, Zack, Carpenter, and Spencer Holbrook are going to talk about a number of things about the Buckeyes and the world of Ohio State football recruiting. So what exactly it's going to be, we don't always know. Sometimes we just wing it. So let's get to it. Spencer's here. Zach's here. I'm here. This is Talking Stuff, the Ohio State recruiting podcast brought to you by Buyers Auto, as I said just about, 4 seconds ago, guys. It's, again, we're in this part of the season where I think Ohio State recruiting fans are watching around the country every week. There's these huge marquee games and tons of players flocking to everywhere, here, there, Georgia, Bama, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, blah, 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 blah. And Ohio State is just do. And I'm telling you, as someone who has covered this now for a decade, longer than both of you two have, this feels very slow to me. How does it feel to you guys?
This is exactly what I was talking about, like one of our first episodes where they get that big Oregon game. They come out of the gate hot and strong with a big non-conference marquee game to have a big visits weekend. And then we have a month and a half before their next marquee game. And that's life in the Big Ten, especially the Big Ten. Well, I was going to say especially the Big Ten East, but I think that's just because Iowa seems to be given the Big Ten West a slightly better name at the top. But yeah, this is kind of what we thought, right, Spencer? I mean, that was going to be sort of with visits wise, it was going to take a little while. We might hit this kind of lull, and that's exactly what's happened, right?
Well, I think if Ohio State had its pick, it would probably have the big games be like for recruiting, be like Tulsa and Akron, because then they could spend more time with the players and not have to worry about the game as much. But the players obviously want to see the big games, and Ohio State just doesn't have any right now. And that Penn State game is going to set it to be absolutely massive. And I'm sure, the couple other games here and there, maybe the Purdue game, it has some visitors. Michigan State might have some visitors. That's another big game. I think Michigan State could be a big recruiting weekend after the Penn State game clears. But yeah, I mean, it's just slow. You're right, Berm. It's incredibly slow right now.
Yeah, and the Big Ten, along with the Fox television networks, are not doing Ohio State any favors with the scheduling. Aside from the fact that all of the marquee games in the Big Ten East are scheduled at the last weekend of October and into November, which means that anyone who does make visits, especially kids from Florida, California, Texas, Arizona, are coming up in the crappy time of year weather-wise. Again, we see this weekend here for Maryland. It's homecoming at Ohio State. It's a game the Buckeyes should win quite handily, if all things, being equal. And yet for a player like Ernest Green, for example, he's not going to be able to take his official visit to Ohio State this weekend because, again, it's a noon game, and that puts the Buckeyes in a bind where they're not able to get some of these kids on campus. Sure, they're going to have some big-name players on campus led by AJ Harris, the five-star cornerback out of Georgia, Bama, Georgia. He's right there. I think he lives on the state line. So I think if he stands with 1 foot like stretched out a little bit, I think he's on both states. But I don't know.
I keep wanting to refer to him as a Georgia prospect because he's so close, and that just flows so well to get potentially get a 5-star out of Georgia. So I think me and Berm keep going back and forth, calling him a sort of a pseudo Georgia prospect.
Yeah, I think Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama are the same city, just depending on which side of the street you're on. So I don't. That said, I'm not a geography major. I don't know. But he's visiting. We'll see other names. Of course, CJ Hicks will be back in town. Like always, and it is one of these weekends that's good for Ohio State for relationship building. It's a key opportunity, as Spencer said, for a player like AJ Harris. This will be the one game day visit he does make to Ohio State. Zach, you and I've talked about how him and his family want a little bit more of a chance to build a relationship with Matt Barnes. Maybe this weekend gives them that opportunity because the game will be over at 3:30, and then they have the whole evening on Saturday to, associate, hang out. But when you're talking about the big marquee names, I mean, I talked to Amari Abor, the borderline 5-star defensive end from Texas a few days ago, and he said he was trying to get up to Ohio State, but right now, the way the kid's talking about the economy. He said, the way flights and
This
stuff
economy?
flights are so expensive that these kids are having a difficult time figuring out how to make it, because the way that things are shaping up for gas price. I mean, it's stupid, but all these things tie into what Ohio State's trying to do, and that is the risk they ran by having essentially all of their top targets take official visits as soon as recruiting opened up, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think Ohio State probably expected a couple of those guys to make a decision by now. If we're just being honest, we gave them all truth serum. I'm sure Ohio State would have been happier if some of these guys would have made decisions after those June visits. But now you kind of just got to live with it and figure out how to get these guys on campus, because that's going to be the key moving forward. I mean, I know that it's hard to kind of pressure a kid to spend his own money to come to campus, but at the same time, you really got to make sure that these guys know that they're priorities by inviting them and making sure they know that you want them back on campus. I think that's the biggest goal right now, is to just stay in their ear and make sure they know it's going to be time well spent and money well spent if you make the trip to Columbus this fall.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Berm, you've been doing this 7 more years than I have, but when you hear a athlete, a prospect say something like that, isn't that usually what kind of, it's almost not, I wouldn't even call it an excuse, but one of those things where like if they're not going to, like something that they just say to make sure that, like, yes, I'm interested in making the visit, but there's 1 or 2 snags that to where I can't make it up there. I mean, haven't you heard that like 100 times and then prospect never ends up visiting?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is that ABOR did visit officially in June, but like any other relationship in people's lives, that we can splash a big relationship advice, logo on this one. You make time for what matters, and you make sacrifices to get where you need to be, and you make sure that, like, if that's a place you want to visit for a game, you find a way to do it. Ironically, there never seems to be a problem for people visiting Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Florida. I don't know how that happens, but Ohio State seems to struggle to get those unofficial visits to happen. I guess I'm not a scientist. I don't know how math works, but it seems like those things figure a way them to work out. But do with that what you want. But obviously, the reality here is Ohio State has 14 commitments in the class of 2022. They have 1 commitment in the class of 2023. They have not added a bunch of guys to the list, and I think that that's what's important to, as you start to really try to evaluate where their confidence level is or where they think they are. Understanding, Spencer, that there hasn't been a rash of new offers out there. There hasn't been a handful of new defensive line offers, even though Kenneth Grant committed to Michigan, even though Chris McClellan right now might be heading back towards Oklahoma, even though there are changes with some of the key guys we've talked about. They're not panicking, which either indicates that A, they feel better about things than people are giving them credit for, or B, the roster being so young gives them flexibility to only take 18 or 19 this year if that's all they want.
I think it could be a little of column A and a little of column B. I think they feel comfortable with where they're at with some of these prospects. And that's usually the biggest tell for Ohio State, is if you see new offers going out in that class, that they're open to searching for new guys to bring in because things are trending in the wrong direction. I think Ohio State's pretty confident right now because of, like you said, Berm, the position they put themselves in with some of these elite recruits on the defensive line. They're just gonna, with Tyleek Williams and Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, like, if you want to come play for Larry Johnson, we'll have you. But if you don't, we've got a young enough roster where, and this is Ohio State talking, we got a young enough roster where if you don't want to come play for us, then we'll just roll with those guys and try again in 23. And I think that's a pretty good strategy to have, because you don't want to start lowering your standards if you're Ohio State to recruits. You need to keep the standard high, and they've targeted the guys who they believe fit the standard and can live up to that standard. And other than that, you don't take anybody else, I don't think.
Yeah, and that's something I've said for a while, Zach, right? The Buckeyes don't do pity offers. They don't, and it's not pity offers to players that aren't good enough to play at Ohio State, but also it's not pity offers in like, oh, we're struggling to recruit someone, so let's offer someone that isn't good enough.
Yeah, I think we've said this ad nauseum like dozens of times in the past of you don't just bring in someone just for numbers. You need depth, but I think with the numbers they have, the talent they have on their roster, they have enough depth in the defensive line room. And Like Spencer said, I think they're comfortable with what they have because you have two things in your bag. If you're Ohio State, you have Larry Johnson, and then you have three freshmen who are starting to come into their own on that defensive line with Tyleik Williams, JT Tuamaloau, and even Jack Sawyer, maybe.
And even Michael Hall.
Yeah, and Mike Hall too. And I think that's a good pitch for Ohio State to have is we have the best defensive line coach in America. And if you have the talent, you come in your first year and we're going to play you. I think we're seeing that kind of play out over the course of the first few weeks. And they have 7 defensive line offers out, I think, right now. And Birmingham, I'm curious. I know we talked about defensive line dominoes and stuff like that. Is there maybe one you think that kind of controls the center of that at all, or not really? I mean, you think they might start falling soon as we head into the middle of October?
Well, I mean, I've long held that I think that Caden Curry may be the most important player left on the Ohio State recruiting board, regardless of position. I think that and I think that he's so important because of the flexibility he brings. Obviously, you're looking at a player that can play inside or outside. You're looking at a player that's regional. You're looking at a player that they identified earlier than everyone else and said, that's our guy. I think that you have an opportunity with players like Curry. I still think Omar Yabor is a real opportunity for Ohio State. I don't know where he fits exactly in this class or when he decides, but all these kids have been back and forth on, I'm going to commit early. I'm going to wait until signing day. It constantly changes. And I mean, Zach, we've talked about Curry so many times, but this is a kid who does not have any panic in him at all about this process. There was conversation about going to Alabama last weekend for the Alabama Ole Miss game. He wasn't even sure if he was going to take that official visit until like last Thursday. And he's like, no, I'll just not go. I'll go in a month from now. Like Ohio State, in their mind, they're probably pulling out their hair going, okay, we need these things to happen so that the decision can get made. But at the same time, you can't force a kid. And on the other side, they're like, okay, if he decides at the last minute to go to Alabama or Indiana or Oregon or Clemson, the way that recruiting is now, the way that essentially for schools like Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, like the rest of college football can be a feeder system for those guys. If they get into February and they're still missing a couple of pieces, it's pretty easy for Ohio State to make it known that, oh boy, we could really use another defensive end. And all of a sudden, players from all over the country that are, juniors in college can go, I would like to play at Ohio State, please. And like the game has changed so much that I think that Ohio State's not holding spots for the transfer portal, but the transfer portal opens up this other door that if you do fall short on the guys you target in high school, you have an opportunity to go out and get college players to replace them. So it's this entirely new dynamic that I think everyone's trying to sort through. Don't you think, Spencer?
Yeah, and I also think that Ohio State takes this approach where some other programs don't, where they're not going to force anyone out of the program. So there's a lot of these guys that we've expected were going to be gone after this year that aren't having the kind of seasons that we really expected them to have, who have extra eligibility due to either another year naturally or with the COVID year. And so I think this is one of those things where Ohio State's not going to panic because, yeah, they'll take another guy who's been developed for 4 years by Larry Johnson, who could be developed for a 5th year by Larry Johnson, probably over a freshman in college who is green and is going to be developed by Larry. So, I mean, they have a lot of options, like you said, the transfer portal, but also the COVID year that's going to allow some of these guys, let's take, for example, maybe a Tyreek Smith, a Javonte Jean-Baptiste. These are really talented guys. Even a Zach Harrison, if he doesn't put up the numbers he wants and doesn't have the draft profile that maybe he wants to have, come back for another year. Do you really need more guys? We talk about the guys that are going to leave. Well, maybe they won't leave. And I think Ohio State's starting to understand that maybe they won't leave. And so you've got all this mix of young talent on the defensive line. You've got these guys who have another chance to come back. And then you've got these recruits who, sure, you can make as big of a pitch to them as you want, but if you don't get them, you've still got a lot of talent in that room to work with. And then you go back to the drawing board and start over in 23.
Zach, let me think about it. Zach, preseason, we all thought Zach Harrison, Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Tyreek Smith, Tyler Friday, who's already said he's coming back next year. The idea was that all those guys would be gone after this season. And now there is at least, as Spencer said, a consideration for Zach Harrison, who's only a junior, that he could return. That Tyreek Smith, who's struggled and hasn't played well, could return and dealing with injuries. So doesn't that change the necessity?
That's hilarious. That's literally exactly what I was going to ask you. I was going to set the table for you, so I'll take this one. I do think that's got to be in some of these guys' minds, like Caden Curry or Kenyatta Jackson, some of those guys of, well, maybe I need to wait and prolong this decision to see whether or not guys like Zach Harrison or Javonte Jean-Baptiste, whether they do develop and maybe they do need to come back for another year. And that has to affect the number of defensive linemen that Ohio State will take in this class, because we keep saying the number 5 over and over again, or 4 at minimum. But if you have a couple guys unexpectedly come back for that extra year, or they don't enter the NFL draft, then I mean, does that number then go down to maybe 3, 4 at max, 3 at minimum? I mean, You would think it probably would have to, right?
You certainly see reason to think it would change. And I think this, and we'll get off this topic afterwards, but I think that if you're looking for an explanation or something to point to as to what makes Ohio State in a lot of ways fundamentally different than Alabama or Georgia, et cetera, Georgia is thinking, like, looking at taking 31 or 32 players in this class of 2022. Ohio State has maybe going to take 18 or 19, maybe 20, depending on what happens with Xavier Wampa and Zion Branch. So the Buckeyes are sincerely concerned about the super senior problem around college football and how it affects their roster. And they're not just making moves and then saying, we'll figure it out later. They're saying, we need to figure this out now before we can really offer more players. And I think that that's interesting. Spencer, wrap it up.
I don't mean to cut you off at all, but like, that's the difference between Ohio State and some of these other programs. Like, Ohio State's not going to force any of these guys out. And so that's why Ohio State's more concerned about super seniors. I'm not going to say anything about any other program. I'm just going to tell you, Ohio State's not going to kick players out of their program for, lack of production or not meeting the 5-star hype that they had out of high school, or, if guys transfer out of Ohio State, it's because they want to leave Ohio State. It's not because Ohio State tells them you need to leave. And so, that's the thing. Like, Ohio State's probably only going to take 20, maybe 21, like you said, 19, 20, maybe 21 tops if things get a little sideways. But like, that's just the way that this is going to go. And I think it's better to set the table for fans about that right now, because when you look at those recruiting rankings in Ohio State, a couple of years ago, they sat at number 14 in the rankings. I think they only took 17 or 18 guys. Like, yeah,
that was when Urban Meyer was leaving and Ryan Day was taking over. There was obviously a transition that but again, the roster was very young. And so they're like, why do we need to panic here?
Yeah. And so, if you only take 19, 20, 21 guys, like, you might find yourself 8, 9, 10 in the recruiting rankings, especially when Penn State's going to take 30 guys, when Georgia's going to take 31 guys. Alabama takes 96 guys every year. So I mean, that's just the way that this thing's going to work.
And
last point.
It kind of brings it back full circle, right, to what we were first talking about, the fact that Ohio State doesn't need to add extra offers just to bring in one guy or 2 guys because of this COVID year, that super senior number. And just final point is, it's interesting because I think we kind of all thought, like 6-7 months ago, whatever the timeline was, this was going to be like a class of 23 or 24 guys and was going to compete for that recruiting crown, when Quinn Ewers and Jaheim Singletary were obviously still in the class. But I think it's fascinating how much has changed, because now this could be one of its smallest classes potentially in the last 5-6 years, to when it looked like it was shaping up to be like 23 or 24. But
yep, you can't spout out off the slogan "developed here" if you're not willing to give guys a chance to get developed. And so Ohio State's not going to give up on players. They're not going to push players out. They're not going to, try to turn over the whole roster every other year. And that is making the 2022 class feel like it's moving pretty slow right now. But, again, Zach, we're talking October 30th, that Penn State weekend. We know that Xavier Wampa is going to be there. We know Zion Branch is going to be there. There's conversation that Caden Curry is going to be there. I expect Ernest Green to be there. I think that there's conversation at least happening with Kenyatta Jackson about him being there. Omari Abor's trying to get himself like that. That weekend is going to bring back so many of the players that visited together on June 4th that it's interesting to me. Like, that could be sort of the bookend of the official visit weekend that started 5 months ago. So neither here nor there. Let's talk about.
I can already tell that in your mind, if that happens, you're like working the story of this like dramatic, like
exactly. It's the first chapter and the last chapter, right? And I think that it's the way Ohio State recruits. It is about relationship building. It's about making sure that these kids know 100% that's where they want to be. A lot of these kids that I just mentioned had the feeling after their official visit in June, like, hey, I should commit. And Ohio State, to their credit, doesn't push the envelope, doesn't tell kids, hey, you need to commit right now or you lose your spot. They encourage kids, go visit other places, go make sure that this is where you want to be. And in some cases, it can open the door for Iowa, for example, who's going to host Xavier Wampa for the third time already this season, this coming weekend as they play Penn State to really make a move. Now, that's a risk for Iowa if they go out, if they were 2-2 right now instead of 4-0 and playing some of the best football in the country. Maybe that feels different, but these are the risks you run. And you know that the Midwest right now, everyone's aiming for Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan, Penn State. I guess I'm still going to consider Penn State the Midwest, but remember, folks, I am not a geographer.
Geographer knowing personer.
Yeah, that's just not me. But all these schools are aiming for Ohio State, and all of them are pointing to the Buckeyes and saying, "Oh, they have all these young guys. They got all this. What do you need to go there for?" And I think that it's just fascinating as you watch it unfold. So anyway, let's talk about the offensive line on this episode of Talking Stuff presented by Buyers Auto. Two guys still committed, Tegra Shabola and George Fitzpatrick. And then there's this hovering group of Ernest Green, of Cam Dewberry, of Carson Hinzman, of Billy Schrouth, who still hasn't committed anywhere, Emil Wagner. There's these 5 guys left that the Buckeyes are considering for this final spot, and none of them seem like they're, wanting it. Is that a major problem?
I just
both of you in unison on the count of 3. Is it a problem? 1, 2, 3.
I think so.
Oh, we got I think so and no. I love it.
You have 6 guys or however many, and it feels like Ohio State isn't in a good position for any of them. And we talked before about how, Berm, I think it's your opinion. I share that too, that 4 linemen is probably the number they should be shooting for. And instead you're probably only going to get 3. And it feels like with the targets they still have left that they're not in a great position for any of them. Spencer, you go. I know me and Spencer disagree on the Carson Hinzman positioning there.
Yeah. Spencer, tell Zack why he's stupid. Go.
Zack, you're stupid because if Carson Hinzman wanted to be committed to Wisconsin right now, he would be committed to Wisconsin right now. Like, here's the thing. Like, we talk about this with Ohio State all the time, but like we never talk about it with other programs. Like, this is a 2022 guy who's 3 months from signing day, has had a Wisconsin offer longer than, any other player has had a Wisconsin offer. And he's from Wisconsin, sees what Wisconsin does on the offensive line and isn't committed to Wisconsin. Like, there are tea leaves that you have to read sometimes. And I feel like this is just one that's being completely ignored because he's from Wisconsin, he'll go to Wisconsin. Like Emil Wagner is the exact same way at Ohio State, in my opinion. Like, if he wanted to be committed to Ohio State right now, he would be in the class. He doesn't want to go to Ohio State. He's finding reasons not. And that's what I feel about Carson Hinzman. Like, this is a guy who has Ohio State and Wisconsin in his top 2. And it should be a foregone conclusion he's going to Wisconsin. The fact that we're even bringing him up on this show tells you what you need to know about this guy. And I don't know him. I don't have any inside information. You just sometimes got to look at things from a 30,000 foot perspective, Berm, and get the perspective in there of, if he wanted to be in that class, he would be in that class. And I think Ohio State's going to pull off this upset. I think he's just the kind of guy who goes to Ohio State.
Now, Zack, tell Spencer why he's stupid. I like this new therapist role I'm playing. Go ahead.
I think Spencer's stupid. He has a stupid face, and now I'm upset. I think, with Carson Hinzman, if he wanted to be in the Wisconsin class, I hear what you're saying, but it's also he has plenty of time to figure out to compare the 2 programs side by side. And I don't know, by the time, if he does make a second visit to Ohio State, he's going to be able to compare the development side by side again. And the relationship he has with Wisconsin, I think, is stronger at this point. And we see time and again. And with recently, a lot of the offensive line recruits that I've been talking to over the past month, it's just the relationship isn't there with Ohio State like it is with others. And what do we always come back to? Number one factor in recruitment is comfort and relationships. And even if the development is there, if Wisconsin and Ohio State's offensive line development is squared up, if they're even equal, then the relationship stuff is gonna win out. And I think that's what's gonna happen here. That's been my read on it, my feeling on it.
Yeah, I think it's just a fascinating recruitment to follow because, again, it's not a guy that Ohio State fans or even Ohio State recruiting writers have talked a lot about over the last few months because the belief was that he's a kid from Wisconsin. He's just going to go to Wisconsin. But he did, visit Ohio State in the summer. He made an official visit in June. He came back for an unofficial visit for the Oregon game, hearing from people that he wants to make sure he gets back to Ohio State one more time before he makes a decision. All those things are indicative of a kid that's very interested in the Buckeyes program. And I think that there's a piece missing here that for athletes, you want to be the best and you want to play at the best. And Ohio State, that challenge is different than it is at Wisconsin. And that's not a knock on Wisconsin because they're struggling this year, whatever. It's historical. There's a million data points to prove it that Ohio State is a different level of place than Wisconsin when it comes to college football. And so I think you have to ask, or I'd like to ask Carson Hinzman, how much of that data point matters to him and his decision? Because there are kids out there who say to themselves, hey, I can play at Ohio State. I can play at Alabama. I can play at Georgia. Once you have that opportunity, that's a unique chance to prove yourself. And sometimes staying home is the path of least resistance. And so it's just assumed. And if we go back to Emeka Egbuka from a year ago, Emeka Egbuka had people all in his ear forever and ever. Why would you go to Ohio State? They got so many good receivers. Why would you go to Ohio State? And the reason he wanted to go to Ohio State was because he wanted to challenge himself against that group. Not to say Ohio State's Wisconsin offensive line disparity is that large, whatever, but there is certainly a different mindset that you have to say, I'm going to Ohio State, regardless of how close Wisconsin is to me, regardless of the fact that Wisconsin's a pretty good program.
Yeah.
Sorry, Spencer, go ahead.
Fight.
Berm, your insistence on pitting us against each other is harming the cohesiveness of this show.
I think it's making it better. We're on the message boards. We're coming at each other. We're supposed to have some sort of pay-per-view boxing match. So here we go. We're duking it out on the Talking Stuff podcast.
I love it.
I guess there's the level, Berm, of that challenge of playing at Ohio State, but also Wisconsin's getting punked on the field right now by Michigan and Notre Dame and all the programs that are supposed to be the second tier in the Midwest. And Wisconsin this year is slipping in that. And then you see Ohio State starting to revitalize itself. And you're going to see Ohio State, presumably they're going to be the favorite in the games against an Iowa in the Big Ten championship game against Michigan, a game against Penn State. And you just look and, that challenge becomes even more evident as Wisconsin sits at, a 7-5 or an 8-4, or, even a 6-6. They don't look very good right now. And then you see Ohio State competing and trying to push for the college football playoff. Those opportunities are real, and they come at you very quickly and very they kind of slap you in the face. And when you look at those opportunities, along with that challenge and that athletic spirit, like you were talking about, of just wanting to have that challenge, I think this is a battle that is going to, the longer it plays out, the more Ohio State needs to feel good about where it is.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think it's an interesting, thing to just watch because, again, if Wisconsin goes out in week one with Carson Hinzman in attendance and blows out Penn State and then beats up Notre Dame and then beats Michigan, it probably makes it easier for Hinzman to say, hey, you know what? Maybe I just need to stay home. There's something building. But when you're a program that is year on, year off, year on, year off, year on, year off, or in their case, generally 2 years on, 1 year off, 2 years on, 1 year off, the way Wisconsin always seems to go. It does add a layer to the thing. And, I think that if you're not looking at all the layers, Zach, then your dip isn't quite as tasty, correct?
That's just a weird phrasing.
Yeah. How tasty is your dip?
Take me off. No comment. One of the things I want to say, just looking at recent examples, there's two sides of the coin, kind of. Look at Zen Mahalski in the 2021 class. That was exactly why he chose to go to Ohio State. Is he told me, why go to Louisville? He was committed to Louisville. Why go there and be good for 3-4 years when you go to Ohio State and eventually be developed into something great after 4 or 5 years? Because he knows he's not going to see the field till his 3rd, 4th, 5th year. And then you have the other side of the coin with Emil Wagner. And I bring that up because Carson Hinzman wasn't offered till mid-June. And I know he told you that Ohio State offering that late wasn't a factor, but I know Zen Mahosky was offered late. He wound up taking that route. He wanted the Ohio State path that you guys were talking about. Emil Wagner, I think Ohio State's probably running 3rd in that recruitment behind Kentucky and Notre Dame. And I think being offered that late was more of a hindrance to Ohio State's chances because, yes, you see that pathway that Ohio State can give you that you're talking about, but also it's a question of, but more of a last minute throw in for depth. I mean, I know Ohio State's going to be battling that.
Doesn't that just come down to who are you listening to? I mean, there are certainly opposing coaches who are going to tell a kid who's in the state of Ohio, the Buckeyes don't want you, otherwise they would have offered you. And that's just simply not true.
Well, kids listen to that though a lot.
Right. Well, right. That's what I'm saying. They're listening to it more and more these days because other coaches are so good at saying it. And the programs that those other coaches are coaching for are getting better. So there's an opportunity to say that, hey, you don't need to wait for that offer because you can come play in the SEC and cut your teeth against the best of the best every day. And Ohio State, that's the problem, right? That's the debate. Emil Wagner, we'll talk about him for a second. He told me just the other day that his intention right now is to make one more visit this month at some point to Notre Dame and then make a decision after that. He does not want to take another visit to Ohio State or take another visit to Kentucky or another visit to Penn State, because then, we've talked about Emil and his analytical side in the past. This is a kid who wants the exact same number of data points for every school. If you go to Ohio State for the Ohio State Penn State game, all of a sudden there's one more dot for Ohio State, and then he has to match up everyone else. So he wants to visit Notre Dame for a game because he hasn't done that yet this season. And once that happens, he'll make a decision. And I agree. I think the Buckeyes are running behind in that battle. I think they're running behind Georgia in the battle for Ernest Green right now. Ernest Green was able to visit Georgia for a home game there. He got to an official visit there. He also saw Georgia when they were playing against Clemson in Charlotte. Ohio State, he was supposed to visit for the Oregon game officially. Noon game didn't happen. The replacement game was going to be this weekend against Maryland. Noon game didn't happen. If Penn State is a noon game, it's not going to happen. So, Ohio State isn't going to go to the TV networks and say, hey, make us a night game, pal. But, I think right now, and Spencer, we've talked about it over the weekend, just you and me and Austin in the car, but it looks like that's going to be a night game against Penn State. And that huge recruiting weekend is going to get even a bigger boost by having it be a night game, under the lights, Halloween, Buckeyes and all scarlet. That is going to be a show.
And even if it is a 3:30 game or a 4:00 game, because I know Fox, if Fox has it and they don't want to put it at noon, Fox loves its 4:00 games. They don't like 3:30. The entire second half, like 3/4 of that game will probably be under the lights regardless. So as long as it's not a noon game, I think it will make it a good recruiting atmosphere for Ohio State. As long as it's not a noon game, I feel like a lot of these guys will be able to make the trip because Ohio State simply doesn't play a lot of 3:30 games. But I do think that extra 3 hours allows for some time to, get on a plane and get to Columbus and see everything. So regardless of whether it's a night game or a 3:30 game, as long as it's not a noon game, Ohio State's got to feel good about what it's doing recruiting. And for the longest time, Vern, we talked about how, the time of game doesn't really affect recruits. Now, when you look at Ohio State and this national approach that they're taking to the way they recruit, the time of the game absolutely is beginning to affect recruiting in ways that we probably didn't even realize it was going to, but it's definitely a factor at this point.
It's not affecting the experience once they're there, Zach. It just stops them from getting there.
Yeah. So 2 things. The time of the game, if we do line up to be a night game, that's 95% a positive for Ohio State because, like we said, I mean, Ernest Green, all those Bosco kids, they couldn't get out here for the Oregon game because it was a noon game. And but it also comes back to what we said earlier is you want to get those California, Texas, Florida kids up to Ohio when it's in September, when it's warmer. October, if it's a night game, probably going to be a little chilly, which I know gives them a little preview of what life could be like at Ohio State, what the weather would be like. But just saying that's the extra added, that's the 5% negative for if it winds up being a night game. And second of all, you mentioned the all scarlet. That a lot of people I know, a lot of Ohio State fans don't like those because it's not as traditional. That's not for Ohio State traditional fans. That's for the players. That's for recruiting. That's a recruiting tactic. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of the guys at Ohio State's recruiting, and pretty unanimous that they all think the jersey are sick, and they like want to take those photo shoots with them. And
in this case, sick means
Day,
good, right? Sick means
right?
good. I'm an old. Sick means good, not sick means bad.
Sick. Actually, the kids say those are tough or those are heat. That's the phrase.
Those things also all mean good.
Tough with 2 F's, TUFF, just so you know, just to get you some learning in here. But
yeah, as an old, a lot of the lexicon is just lost on me.
Less than an hour after those all scarlet color rush jerseys were announced, Brian Day and all some of the coaches were on the phone, either texting or calling recruits. Like, that was a topic that was brought up. That's very. I just wanted to mention that because it is a recruiting tactic. It's just another one of those little things that if it's all scarlet under the lights.
Spencer, as one of the youngs, would you be willing to go work for another outlet if they had tough clothes?
No, I like the clothes that I have here.
I like fashion, boys and girls. Fashion. Guys, I don't know. What else are we going to talk about? Because I think we should be. I think we're done with this. We're going to come back later this week. Zach and Andrew Ellis and myself are going to come back with a 2023 version of the list that we're going to talk about, the top 9 most important players in the class of 2023 for Ohio State. And I bet you know who's at the top of that list, everyone. It's Sonny Styles.
It's Arch Manning.
Did you already do Sonny Styles for the list?
No, we did. Yeah, we did. Sonny was the first and at this point only member of the list, like individually in the class of 2023. But this will be the full, the expanded version, the version.
Yeah, before we get out of here, everybody make sure that you rush to Twitter and ask Berm if the Buckeyes are going to recruit Arch Manning.
They're not. I mean, they would if they needed to, but they're not. So, and thank God for it, everyone, because I can't handle another circus. I mean, I could. It just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So please don't ask me that on Twitter. Please don't. I think that's it.
I had one last important thing. Speaking of the 23 list guys, and we talked about this at the beginning of the show, is the AJ Harris visiting and having questions for the staff. I know I asked Ryan Day on Tuesday if Kerry Combs and Matt Barnes switching roles, with Matt going to being the defensive play caller now, if that affects any recruiting involvement, or if Matt Barnes' role has expanded. And he said nothing's changed. They haven't had any questions or concerns about the future of those two guys and their roles. But I think, and I assume that's 100% true, but that maybe parents and recruits haven't been asking about that. But I think that's going to change. I think that could change this weekend when AJ visits. I think they're going to have questions, and it's just about getting answers. It's about Ohio State's staff being forthright with what the plan is, and just keeping them involved in that process, because Matt Barnes might be the secondary recruiter along with Kerry Combs for AJ Harris and other guys like that.
It's weird because in the world of recruiting, sometimes the worst thing you can do is tell someone I don't know, because it's almost like you'd rather not tell the truth, because that at least you can explain away by saying, oh, things change. But when you're talking about the Ohio State defensive staff, there's a lot of I don't knows. I mean, the Buckeyes are obviously improving. Things are getting better. But I think the reason that Ryan Day and the staff hasn't gotten those questions is because recruits and their families would have to assume that the answer is going to be, we don't know, or that the answer is subject to change. And, I think for Ohio State, the most important way to answer that question is to go out on Saturday against Maryland and to show continued improvement and growth from a defense that looked Ohio State caliber against Rutgers. Now they have to do it against a slightly better offensive, unit at Maryland and keep growing. And that is the best way to answer the question, is for Matt Barnes, Kerry Combs, all the guys that are running that defense to go out there and say, look, our defense is going to be fine. And, some of the questions will be about who's calling what, who's coaching what. But again, you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right, Spence?
Absolutely.
But Zach, you're right, because people are certainly going to be wondering. And if they're not asking it directly, they're wondering it privately. And I think it's incumbent upon Ohio State to get ahead of that and to say, hey, this is our plan moving forward. And, with the asterisk right next to it, subject to change, because you don't know.
And you don't have to tell them absolutely everything, but keep them in the loop. Keep them in the loop and have them, like you said, the proof in the pudding. I got it in there, Spencer. I got proof in the pudding in the podcast. We got the bingo card ready.
It's the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm talking stuff presented by Buyers Auto.
Fight. Thanks for watching, everyone. That's Spencer Holbrook. That's Zack Carpenter. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. Please rate, review, subscribe. Give us a like, whatever else you can do on this thing. And don't forget to head over to on3.com, sign up for the website, and $10 for a year gets you all of this, everything else we do at lettermenrow.com, including our Lettermen Lounge, where we talk recruiting and whatever else with you guys on the message board. So hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks for watching.